Was lying in that hospital bed when she walked in, and I knew from the way she held that envelope that she hadn't come to check on me. 63 years old, 29 years of marriage, and my wife walked into my recovery room carrying divorce papers like she was dropping off dry cleaning. She didn't even say hello. She set the envelope on the tray table next to my water cup and said, "I need you to sign those before the end of the week, Walter." Walter. Not honey, not sweetheart. Not even my name said with any warmth. Just Walter, the way you'd say it to a stranger who'd overstayed his welcome. I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. She was dressed nicely, nicer than she'd been dressing for me in years, now that I think about it. Hair done. That perfume I didn't recognize until about 8 months ago. I said I just had surgery 2 days ago. She said, I know. That's why I'm giving you until the end of the week. Then she left. I lay there for a long time after that. The ivy was still in my arm. The compression sleeves on my legs were humming, squeezing, releasing, squeezing, releasing. Some machine beeped every 40 seconds in the hallway, and I held that envelope and I thought not about the marriage, not about what we'd lost or what she wanted. I thought about what my attorney had told me 3 weeks earlier, before the surgery, when I'd first started to suspect something was very wrong. He had said, "If she files, make sure you let me know the minute those papers appear." I set the envelope back on the tray table without opening it. Then I called him. Let me back up because none of this started in that hospital room. It started the way most quiet disasters start, with something small that didn't add up. Last spring, I was going through our home equity line statement online. We've had that account for 11 years. We used it to put a new roof on the house back in 2018, paid it back down, hadn't touched it since. The balance should have been just under $4,000, some lingering interest charges I'd been meaning to clear up. The balance was gone. The account showed a zero balance because someone had drawn the remaining credit, $22,000, and transferred it out. My name was on that account. My wife's name was on that account. I hadn't touched it. I sat at the kitchen table for probably 20 minutes before I called the bank. The representative confirmed the withdrawal had been made 6 weeks earlier online from an IP address I didn't recognize. No fraud flag had triggered because the login used our correct credentials. The transfer went to an account linked to my wife's name, and there was nothing technically irregular about it. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" she asked. I said no and hung up. My wife was at her sister's that weekend. At least that's where she said she was. I walked around that house for 2 days trying to think through what I knew versus what I suspected. $22,000 transferred to an account in her name. No conversation, no mention. Just gone. When she got home Sunday evening, I didn't say anything about it. I needed to think first. I needed to understand the whole picture before I showed my hand. That's something I learned in 40 years of working in commercial insurance. You don't talk until you know what you're looking at. I spent the next 2 weeks pulling threads. Our joint savings account had been drawn down significantly over the prior 8 months. Withdrawals of $2, $3, sometimes $4,000 at a time, spaced out enough that they didn't spike any alerts. Our investment account, which we'd built slowly since our early 40s, showed she had requested a change to sole beneficiary designation on her individual portion 9 months ago. I hadn't been notified because it was her individual allocation, and I'd never thought to check. I found a second email address I didn't know about. I found charges on a credit card, a card I didn't know existed, in her name only, that showed hotel stays in a city 2 hours from us, on weekends when I thought she'd been visiting her college friend. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I wasn't hurt. I was. I am, 29 years. We raised 2 kids in the house we still lived in. I coached Little League. She taught Sunday school for 6 years. We had a life that looked, from the outside, like a life worth having. But I had done enough investigating by that point to know that whatever she was building toward, she'd been building it quietly, carefully, for the better part of a year. Maybe longer. I hired an attorney, a good one, a man named Jeffrey Greer, who came recommended by a colleague and who had the kind of calm, organized manner that made me feel like things were manageable even when they weren't. I told him everything I'd found. He listened without interrupting, made notes, and at the end he said 2 things. First, don't move any money yourself. Don't transfer anything. Don't close anything. Every action you take right now becomes part of the record. Second, We're going to need to establish the marital asset timeline before she files. If she files first and you're unprepared, you lose ground that's very hard to recover. We had started that process, pulling records, documenting the account activity, establishing what the marital estate actually looked like when I had the health scare. I'd been having intermittent chest pressure for about 6 weeks. I kept chalking it up to stress, which it partly was. But when it woke me up at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday and didn't go away, I drove myself to the emergency room. My wife was asleep when I left. I didn't wake her. They admitted me immediately. Turned out I had a significant blockage, 2 arteries, one of them serious enough that they scheduled me for surgery within 36 hours. Not open heart, but not nothing either. A catheterization, stent placement, the whole procedure. My son flew in from Phoenix. My daughter drove up from Richmond. They were both there when I came out of recovery. My wife arrived the following morning. She came with a small bag of things from home. My phone charger, a book I hadn't asked for, my reading glasses. She sat in the chair across the room and asked the nurse questions I could have answered myself. She didn't hold my hand. She barely looked at me. My son noticed. He didn't say anything in the room, but he caught me alone in the hallway when I was finally allowed to walk a few laps, and he said, "Dad, what's going on with you two?" I told him some of it, not all of it. Enough that he understood the visit with the divorce papers 2 days later wasn't coming out of nowhere. The morning she came with the envelope, my daughter had gone to get breakfast in the cafeteria. My son had left the night before to get back to work. It was just me, and then suddenly it was her, and then it was just me again with an envelope I hadn't opened. I called Jeffrey that afternoon. He picked up on the second ring. I told him she delivered papers. He said, "Don't sign anything. Don't open it without me present if you can help it." "I'll be there tomorrow morning," I said. "She gave me until end of the week," he said. "Her timeline doesn't govern ours." He came the next morning, a Thursday. He sat in the chair my wife had occupied 2 days earlier, opened his briefcase on his lap, and we went through everything together. He had already been served with notice through her attorney, a firm I recognized by name, expensive, downtown. She had filed in circuit court 2 days before she walked into my room. The papers she brought me were her petition and a proposed settlement agreement, not a court order. I wasn't required to sign anything on her schedule. "What does the proposed settlement look like?" I asked. He handed me the summary sheet. I read through it. She was proposing to keep the house, both vehicles, the joint investment account, and 50% of my pension. I would receive the remaining pension half, my individual retirement account, and a cash payment of $15,000, which, given that she had already removed more than that from our joint assets in the past 8 months, was not a settlement. It was an insult dressed up in legal formatting. I said she took $22,000 from the home equity line and pulled down our savings account significantly. Does her proposed settlement account for any of that? Jeffrey said, "No, but ours will." I was in that hospital room for 5 more days before they discharged me. During that time, I had 2 more visits from my wife and several long phone calls with Jeffrey. The visits from my wife were brief and businesslike. She wanted to know if I'd looked at the papers. I told her my attorney was reviewing them. She said her attorney was ready to move forward quickly. I told her mine was too. We spoke to each other with the careful politeness of people who have stopped pretending and not yet figured out what comes next. During one of those visits, she said something that has stayed with me. She said, "I just want this to be over." I thought about 29 years. I thought about the house, the kids, the Little League seasons, the Sunday school classes, the vacations we took when money was tight and we made the best of it anyway. I thought about the second email account and the hotel charges and $22,000 moved in the middle of the night. I said, "I know you do." She left. What she didn't know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that our attorney had already filed a motion to freeze marital assets pending discovery. She had initiated the divorce, which meant the court now had jurisdiction over the marital estate. Every transfer she had made in the prior 12 months was now subject to review as potential dissipation of marital assets. The $22,000 from the home equity line, the savings withdrawals, the investment account beneficiary change. Her attorney would find out about the motion when it landed in their inbox. I knew because Jeffrey had told me she'll find out when they tell her. and then she'll understand the position she's in. I went home to a quiet house on a Saturday afternoon, my son driving me because the doctor didn't want me behind the wheel for 2 weeks. My daughter had stocked the refrigerator and left a note on the kitchen counter. My wife had moved some of her things out while I was in the hospital: clothes, her jewelry box, some items from the bathroom. The house felt hollowed out in the specific way that only happens when a person is both gone and still legally attached to everything in it. I sat in my armchair, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. But I also felt something else. A steadiness. The kind that comes not from everything being okay, but from knowing exactly where you stand and having done the right things in the right order. The discovery process took 4 months. Her attorney pushed back on the asset freeze, argued that the transfers had been for household expenses. Jeffrey's response was thorough and documented. He had the bank records, the IP logs, the transfer dates cross-referenced with statements from the account she had transferred the money into, an account that, it turned out, was connected to a joint account she held with another individual. A name I didn't know, a man, Jeffrey confirmed, who was approximately 12 years younger than me and who had a record of financial fraud charges in a neighboring state that had been reduced to a civil settlement. When that came out in discovery, the tone of the proceedings changed very quickly. Her attorney requested a settlement conference. We agreed. Jeffrey and I sat on one side of a conference table. Her attorney and my wife sat on the other. My wife didn't look at me for most of the meeting. When she did, briefly, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, more like exhaustion. Like she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and it had turned out to be heavier than she'd planned for. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest about that. I didn't feel a surge of victory or vindication sitting across from her. I felt sad. I felt the particular sadness of watching something that used to be good reveal, slowly and in detail, how long it had been going wrong before either of you named it. But I also sat up straight and I let Jeffrey do his job. The final settlement was different from what she'd proposed in that hospital room. I kept the house. She received her share of the investment account, reduced by the documented value of the assets she had transferred out during the marriage. The home equity withdrawal, the savings draws, the amounts traced to that joint account with the other man. Her attorney tried to argue that the final figure was punitive. Jeffrey presented the spreadsheet, line by line, and let the numbers answer for themselves. She received her portion of my pension calculated from the date of marriage to the date she filed, which is standard, but which was a smaller figure than her original proposal had assumed, because she had filed before I'd reached the peak earning years of my pension calculation. Her attorney had advised her to file quickly. It had cost her. The house needed work. She had let some maintenance slide in the months before she left, and there were small things everywhere that needed attention. I spent the first summer after the divorce painting the porch myself, slowly, with the caution the cardiologist had recommended. My son came for a long weekend and we fixed the gutters. My daughter called every Sunday. I put the second bedroom back together as a guest room. I reorganized the garage. I found a men's group at my church for divorced and widowed men over 55, and I started going on Thursday evenings, and I sat in those folding chairs, and I listened, and I talked, and it helped more than I expected anything to help. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy or because I want to make anyone look bad. My wife made her choices. I made mine. Some of mine, earlier in that marriage, probably weren't the right ones either. I worked too much. I was absent in ways that don't show up on a bank statement. I'm not naive enough to think all the fault fell on one side of the table. But I'll tell you what I've learned, sitting in this chair at 64 years old, with a couple of stents in my heart, and a house that's quiet in a way I'm still getting used to. I've learned that the moment you sense something is wrong, you pay attention. Not because you want to find something bad, you don't, but because the alternative is looking up one day and finding that while you were hoping everything was fine, someone else was making plans. I've learned that getting good advice early is not a sign of distrust. It's a sign of taking care of yourself, the same way you tell anyone you love to take care of themselves. I've learned that a man can be lying in a hospital bed, 2 days out of cardiac surgery, with divorce papers sitting on his bedside table, and still be okay. Not immediately, not painlessly, but okay. The envelope she left sat on that tray table for a full day before I moved it. I never did sign what was inside it. Eventually, a different set of papers. Ones that said what was fair and documented the truth were the ones that closed out 29 years of marriage. I drive past that church where she used to teach Sunday school sometimes. I drive past that and I keep going. There's nothing there for me to do except remember that it was real once, and that real things ending doesn't mean they weren't worth having. But I'm also still here. The porch looks good. The gutters are clean. On Thursday evenings, I sit in a folding chair and I listen to other men tell their stories. And sometimes I tell mine, and the room is always warmer than you'd expect for a church basement in November. That's enough. At 64, after everything, that is genuinely enough. I've thought a lot about timing, looking back on all of it. Not the timing of the surgery, or the timing of her walking into that room with the envelope. I mean the deeper kind of timing, the way choices compound, the way a person can spend months quietly making decisions that feel safe and clever, and never stop to consider that every action leaves a trail, and every trail tells a story, and eventually someone is going to read it. She had been moving money for the better part of a year before I ever sat down at that kitchen table and noticed the home equity balance. She had been careful, she had been patient, and I think she believed that patience was the same thing as wisdom. It isn't. Patience in the service of something dishonest is just a slower way to build a problem you'll eventually have to stand in front of. I don't say that with anger anymore. I say it because it's true, and because I spent a long time being angry, and the anger didn't change a single line of the bank statements. What changed things was something simpler and harder at the same time. I paid attention. I made calls. I sat across from Jeffrey and told him the truth about everything I'd found, even the parts that were embarrassing, the parts that made me look like a man who hadn't been watching his own life closely enough. That wasn't easy, but I've come to believe that the willingness to see clearly, even when what you're seeing reflects poorly on you, is one of the only forms of intelligence that actually matters when things fall apart. She came into that hospital room thinking she held every card. She'd filed first, she'd moved the assets, she'd chosen her attorney, she'd set her timeline. From where she was standing, I was a 63-year-old man 2 days out of cardiac surgery with no leverage and no plan. And I understood why she thought that. I had looked that way from the outside for a long time. But here's what I know now, and what I wish I could say to any person sitting in a difficult room feeling like the walls are closing in. The moment you decide to stop reacting and start thinking, the room gets bigger. Not immediately, not comfortably, but it gets bigger. Jeffrey told me early on not to move money, not to make threats, not to do anything that would cloud the record. I followed that advice exactly, and the record, clean, documented, patient, did more work in that courtroom than anything I could have said or done out of anger. The numbers told the truth. The transfer logs told the truth. The IP addresses and the timestamps and the account linked to a man with a fraud history told the truth. I didn't have to raise my voice once. That's what I mean when I think about how consequences work. Not in some abstract sense. I mean it concretely, practically. The decisions she made left marks. The decisions I made left marks. And when you lay them all side by side in a conference room with attorneys on both sides of a table, what you actually done turns out to matter a great deal more than what you intended. I painted that porch myself last summer, slowly with breaks, the way the cardiologist suggested. It took 3 days instead of one, and I didn't mind. There's a kind of peace that comes from doing a small thing carefully and finishing it right. I think that's the only philosophy I can honestly offer after 64 years. Do the small things carefully, tell the truth about the big things, and don't confuse someone else's urgency for your obligation. The porch looks good. That's enough.